My name is Sarah Miller, and I am 32 years old. 3 hours ago, I was standing behind the heavy, oak-carved front door of my home in the upscale suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina, watching the security feed on my phone. Outside, under a relentless October downpour, two people were shivering. They looked smaller than I remembered. My father, Thomas, was clutching a soaked manila envelope to his chest like a life preserver, his shoulders hunched against the wind. My mother, Martha, was leaning against him, her thin coat offering no protection from the chill. They didn't know I was watching. They didn't know that the house they were desperately visiting, the one they hoped would belong to a sympathetic investor, was mine. I took a breath, smoothed the silk of my blouse, and pulled the door open. The warm glow of my foyer spilled out onto the porch, illuminating the shock on their faces. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the heavy rhythm of the rain hitting the driveway. "Sarah?" My mother's voice was a fragile whisper, barely audible over the storm. She blinked, looking past me at the marble floors and the crystal chandelier, then back at my face. "What? What are you doing here?" "I live here, Mom," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the anger I thought I would feel. It was just cold. My father stepped forward, his eyes darting around in confusion. "We're here to see the new owner. The bank said the debt was bought out. We're here to ask for an extension." He held up the soaked envelope. "We have the paperwork. We just need a little more time to get Jackson back on his feet, and then—" He stopped mid-sentence as his brain finally connected the dots. He looked at the designer keys hanging by the door, then at the professional confidence in my posture. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "You," he breathed, the word tasting like lead in his mouth. "You bought the house?" "I didn't just buy a house, Dad," I replied, stepping back to let them see the full extent of the life I had built without them. "I bought your debt, every single cent of it." I looked at the man who had once told me I was worthless, and the woman who had stood by and watched him say it. They looked like strangers to me now. "The day you threw me out in the middle of the night," I continued, my voice steady as a heartbeat, "I decided that one day you would stand exactly where you are standing now, shivering, desperate, asking me for help." I reached out and took the wet file from his shaking hands. "From today, this house is mine, and so are your choices." Before I tell you exactly how the girl who was treated like a servant became the woman holding her family's fate in her hands, we need to go back. We need to go back to the night a dirty car and a set of keys changed everything. Now let's leave this rainy porch for a moment. Let me take you back to where the cracks in our family first started to show. Let's go back to a humid Tuesday evening in our old kitchen 3 years ago, right before a single request and a set of car keys changed the course of my life forever. My life for the last 5 years was a masterclass in invisibility. We lived in a 2-story colonial on Willow Creek Drive in a quiet, manicured suburb of Charlotte. From the outside, the Miller household was the picture of Southern middle-class stability. The lawn was always mowed, the shutters were painted a crisp navy, and there was always a seasonal wreath on the front door. But inside, the air was heavy with the scent of unacknowledged debt and a favoritism so thick you could choke on it. By 29, my schedule was a relentless loop of exhaustion. My first day started at 6:00 a.m. I'd be at my desk at Miller & Associates. No relation to us, just a corporate logistics firm where I worked as a senior administrative assistant, by 7:30 a.m. I lived on black coffee and the fear of a late fee. By 4:30 p.m., most people were heading home to relax. I was heading to a second-hand Corolla to change into a different uniform. From 5:30 p.m. until 11:00 p.m., 4 nights a week, I was a waitress at The Greasy Spoon, a high-volume diner near the interstate. I didn't do this because I loved the hustle. I did it because I was the only thing standing between my parents and the street. My father, Thomas, had been a foreman at a textile mill that closed down years ago. He'd taken a massive hit to his pension and worked odd jobs at a hardware store, but his pride was still the size of a skyscraper. My mother, Martha, was a sweet woman who had spent 40 years managing the home, which was a polite way of saying she looked the other way while the bank accounts drained. And then there was Jackson, my younger brother, the golden boy. Jackson was 24, handsome in a lazy sort of way, and possessed a talent for spending money he hadn't earned. He had graduated with a degree in marketing that he'd never used, mostly because he was waiting for the right opportunity, which apparently meant a CEO position with a corner office and zero responsibilities. In the meantime, he lived in his childhood bedroom, slept until noon, and drove a leased BMW that cost more per month than our mortgage. The dynamic was simple. I was the ATM, and Jackson was the star. I remember a specific Tuesday evening, about a year before the car incident. I had just finished a double shift. My feet felt like they were made of lead, and my back was screaming. I walked into the kitchen to find the three of them sitting around the dining table, laughing over a stack of takeout boxes from an expensive Italian place downtown. "Oh, Sarah, you're home," my mother said, not looking up from her lasagna. "There's some salad left in the fridge if you're hungry." Jackson was wearing a new designer watch, the rose gold catching the light of the chandelier. "Check this out, sis," he said, tilting his wrist. "Limited edition. Got a great deal on it from a guy I met at the gym. It really completes the look for my consulting meeting tomorrow." "Consulting meeting?" I asked, dropping my heavy bag on the floor. "I thought you were still waiting to hear back from that firm in Raleigh." "This is freelance, Sarah," Thomas interjected, his voice sharp. He looked at me with a disappointment he didn't even try to hide. "Jackson is making moves. He's got vision, unlike some people who are content just clocking in and out of a cubicle." I felt the sting behind my eyes, but I pushed it down. "Dad, the mortgage is due on Friday, and the utility bill came in today. It's $300 because someone keeps leaving the AC at 68 degrees all day." Jackson rolled his eyes. "God, Sarah, why are you always such a buzzkill? We're celebrating here. I told you, this consulting gig is going to pay off big time." "Who paid for the Italian food, Jackson?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "I put it on the house account," he said casually, reaching for a breadstick. The house account was a credit card in my father's name that I paid off every single month with my waitress tips. My parents knew this, Jackson knew this, but we all played the game. We all pretended the money came from a magical, invisible well, rather than the sweat on my brow and the ache in my joints. Thomas slammed his hand on the table. "Enough! I won't have you interrogating your brother at the dinner table. He's trying to build a future. You should be supporting him, not dragging him down with your petty accounting." That was my role, the petty accountant, the one who worried about bread while they dreamed of cake. For the next year, it only got worse. I watched Jackson buy new clothes, go out to bars every weekend, and post photos of his entrepreneurial lifestyle on Instagram, all while I was skipping lunches to save $20. My mother would come to me privately, her voice thin and apologetic. "Sarah, honey," she'd whisper in the hallway, "the property taxes are coming up. Do you think you could, help out just this once? I don't want to worry your father. His heart, Just this once was every 6 months. I'd sigh, look at my meager savings, and transfer the money. I was 29 years old, and I had nothing to my name but a pile of debt that wasn't even mine, and a reputation for being the difficult daughter because I dared to ask where the money was going. I worked so hard that I became a ghost in my own home. I was the person who did the laundry, the person who filled the pantry, the person who ensured the lights stayed on. But when the Miller family went to church on Sundays, or when they had neighbors over for a barbecue, I was an afterthought. Thomas would spend an hour bragging to the neighbors about Jackson's investments and potential, while I was the one flipping the burgers and refilling the lemonade. "Sarah's just focused on her little job," he'd say with a dismissive wave if anyone asked about me. "She doesn't have Jackson's spark." The spark. That was the word he used for Jackson's narcissism. I began to realize that my parents didn't love me for who I was. They loved me for what I provided. I was a utility, like the water or the gas. As long as I was flowing, I was ignored. It was only when I threatened to stop that they truly saw me. I started keeping a secret. Every month, I'd take $50, just 50, and put it into a separate private account that I didn't tell anyone about. It was my sanity fund. It was the only thing that belonged to me. I'd sit in the diner's break room, looking at the balance on my phone, imagining a life where I didn't have to pay for my brother's ego. I didn't know it then, but that $50 was the seed of the empire I would eventually build. But the pressure was building. Jackson's BMW lease was falling behind. Thomas's hardware store hours were cut. And the house we all lived in, was starting to groan under the weight of the second mortgage my father had taken out without telling me, a mortgage he'd used to invest in one of Jackson's failed app ideas. The atmosphere in that house was a powder keg. All it needed was a single spark to blow the whole lie apart. That spark came on a humid Tuesday evening after a shift so long my body felt like it was running on fumes. The humidity in Charlotte that evening was like a physical weight, the kind that makes the air feel thick enough to swallow. I had spent 12 hours on my feet, 6 at the firm, followed by a grueling dinner rush at the diner where a busload of tourists had decided to stop. My back felt like it was being pulled apart by hot wires, and my uniform was damp with the smell of spilled coffee and industrial floor cleaner. All I could think about was a cold shower and the relative peace of my bedroom. But as soon as I stepped through the front door, the peace I craved vanished. Jackson was lounging on the sofa, his feet up on the coffee table I had polished just 2 days ago. He was scrolling through his phone, laughing at something, while my father, Thomas, stood by the window, looking out at the driveway with a scowl that usually meant someone was about to get a lecture. "You're late," Thomas said. "No, hello. No, how was your shift?" Just a cold observation of the clock. "The bus was delayed and the diner was packed, Dad," I said, dropping my bag by the door. "I'm exhausted. I'm going upstairs." "Not yet. You aren't," he barked. He turned around and I saw the car keys in his hand. Jackson's keys, the ones to the leased BMW I was effectively paying for. "Jackson has a date tonight with Sophia. Her father is on the board of that country club Jackson's trying to join. He needs to make a good impression." I leaned against the wall, my eyes closing for a second. "That's great for him, Dad. I hope he has a nice time. Now, if you'll excuse me—" "The car is filthy, Sarah," Thomas interrupted, his voice rising. "He took it through that construction zone near the interstate this morning. It's covered in red clay and dust. He can't show up looking like a slob. I want you to go out there, give it a full wash, and put a coat of wax on it. I want it shining before he leaves at 8. I looked at Jackson. He didn't even look up from his phone. He just let out a lazy, "Yeah, sis, make sure you get the wheels. The brake dust is a nightmare." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but it wasn't from the AC. It was the first spark of a fire that had been building for 29 years. "No," I said. The word was small, but in that quiet house, it sounded like a gunshot. Jackson's thumb stopped moving over his screen. Thomas froze. "What did you say?" Thomas asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I said no, Dad," I repeated, my voice steadier than I expected. "I've worked 14 hours today. I pay 60% of the mortgage on this house. I pay for the groceries. I paid the utility bill this morning so the lights wouldn't be cut off. And I am the one who makes sure Jackson's lease doesn't go into default. If Jackson wants a clean car for his date, he has 2 hands. He can wash it himself." Jackson finally stood up, a smug, offended look on his face. "Dad, tell her. I have to get ready. I have to shower and pick out my suit. I don't have time to be scrubbing tires in the driveway." Thomas stepped toward me, his face turning a dark, mottled red. "You listen to me, young lady. This family works because everyone has a role. Jackson is building a future. He is making connections that will move this family forward. Your role is to support us. You have always been the stable one, the one who takes care of the details. Now don't you get ungrateful and start throwing your contributions in our faces." "Ungrateful?" I laughed, and the sound was jagged. "I am the only reason you still have a roof over your head. How am I the ungrateful one? I'm the maid, the bank, and the ghost in this house. Jackson spends more on hair gel in a month than I spend on myself in a year." Why is his potential more valuable than my actual work? Because he has vision, Thomas shouted, his hand slamming against the hallway table. You're just a girl who works at a diner and a desk. You don't understand what it takes to be someone. Now get out there and wash that car. That is an order. I looked past my father and saw my mother, Martha, standing in the kitchen doorway. She was clutching a dish towel, her eyes wide with fear. She looked at me, then at Thomas, and then she looked down at her feet. She didn't say a word. She never did. She was like the mothers in the stories I'd heard, fragile, apologetic, and ultimately a silent witness to the destruction of her own child. Mom, I whispered, are you going to let him say this? You know I'm the one holding everything together. Martha's voice was a thin, trembling reed. Sarah, honey, just do it for your father. Don't make a scene. It's just a car. It'll only take an hour. Please, for the sake of peace in the house. Peace? I felt something break inside me. It was a clean, sharp snap. There is no peace here, Mom. There's only a hostage situation, and I'm the hostage. I looked at Thomas. I'm not washing the car, and I'm not paying the internet bill tomorrow, and I'm not transferring the money for the property taxes. Thomas's eyes turned ice cold. He walked to the hall closet, pulled out my old, battered suitcase, and threw it onto the floor at my feet. If you want to talk about your money and your rules, then you can go find a house where those rules matter, he said, his voice trembling with rage. As long as you are under my roof, you obey me. If you think you're too good to help your brother, then you're too good for this family. Dad, wait, Jackson started, probably realizing that if I left, the money left too. Shut up, Jackson, Thomas roared. He looked at me. Pack your things, now. You have 10 minutes before I throw everything you own onto the lawn. You want to be independent? Fine. Go be independent. See how far your worthless attitude gets you without a family behind you. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I walked upstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed that suitcase and stuffed it with as much as I could, my clothes, my few books, and the small wooden box where I kept my secret savings. I moved with a mechanical precision. When I came back down, Thomas was holding the front door open. The rain had started, a sudden, violent southern downpour. Sarah, please, my mother whispered, but she didn't move to stop him. I walked past them. I didn't look at Jackson, who was standing there looking suddenly unsure of himself. I didn't look at my mother. I looked straight at Thomas. You told me I was worthless, Dad, I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the rain. I want you to remember that word, because one day it's going to be the only thing you have left. He shoved my suitcase out onto the wet porch and slammed the door. The sound of the deadbolt clicking into place was the most honest thing I had heard in that house for years. I stood there in the dark, the rain soaking through my uniform in seconds, clutching my suitcase. I was 29 years old, I was homeless, and I had exactly $400 in a secret account. But as I walked toward the bus stop, my heels splashing in the puddles, I didn't feel like I had lost. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally, truly, standing on my own 2 feet. I didn't know it then, but that rainy night was the foundation of the empire I was about to build. And I knew, with a certainty that burned in my chest, that the next time I stood on that porch, I wouldn't be the one asking for entry. The first thing I learned that night, standing under the bus stop awning while the rain turned my suitcase into a sodden mess, was that silence has a weight. For 29 years, my life had been filled with the noise of my father's demands, my mother's apologies, and my brother's endless excuses. Now, as I watched the empty street, there was only the sound of the rain. It was terrifying, and for the first time, it was mine. I spent the first 3 nights in a motel off I-77. It was the kind of place that smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial-grade lavender, a room that cost $45 a night and took a significant chunk out of my $400 survival fund. I didn't cry. I sat on the edge of the polyester bedspread and opened my laptop. I had a job. Two, actually. And for the first time in my life, every cent I earned was going to stay in my own pocket. The transition was brutal. I moved into a studio apartment in a part of Charlotte that tourists don't visit. A place where the floorboards creaked like old bones and the kitchen was just a hot plate and a bar sink. But on that first Friday, when my paycheck hit my account, I sat on the floor of that empty room and looked at the numbers. For years, I had been transferring 60% of my income to my father's account. I had been paying for Jackson's premium cable, his gym membership, and the interest on a second mortgage I hadn't signed for. When I stopped the automatic transfers, when I snapped that house account card, my financial reality shifted overnight. I wasn't poor. I was actually quite comfortable, as long as I wasn't supporting 3 adults who treated me like a utility. I stayed at Miller & Associates, the logistics firm. My boss, a sharp woman named Elena who saw everything but said little, called me into her office 2 weeks after I left home. "Sarah," she said, looking over her glasses, "you're staying late every night, and you're hitting your KPIs twice as fast as the rest of the admin pool. What's the goal?" "The goal is to never be invisible again, Elena," I replied. She didn't ask for details. She just handed me a folder. "We're opening a new branch in commercial real estate acquisitions. I need someone who knows how to read a ledger and doesn't get emotional about the numbers. It's a promotion. More hours, but the commission structure is aggressive. Interested?" I didn't just say yes. I lived that job. While Jackson was likely still sleeping until noon, in the house I was no longer heating, I was in the office at 6:30 a.m. I learned the language of deeds, easements, and post-rezoning values. I learned how to look at a piece of worthless land and see the interstate interchange that was planned for 5 years down the road. I became a senior advisor in 18 months. My name was finally on the door of my own office. I was quietly generous to myself. I bought a small, reliable car, outright, no lease. I moved into a high-rise downtown where the security guard knew my name and the windows looked out over the city lights. I started a new bank account, one that grew with the speed of my ambition. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was the silence from Willow Creek Drive. In the beginning, the phone rang constantly. Thomas left voicemails that started with anger. "How dare you leave us in the lurch?" and ended with a pathetic, demanding tone. "The internet is cut off, Sarah. Fix it." Martha sent texts that were worse. "Honey, Jackson is so stressed he can't find a job because he's so worried about the bills. Just a small loan, please?" I didn't answer. I didn't block them, not yet, because I wanted to see the arc of their descent. It was a cold, calculated inventory of their true feelings. They didn't ask if I was safe. They didn't ask where I was sleeping. They only asked for the money I had taken with me. I realized then that my father's pride was actually just a mask for his laziness, and my mother's fragility was her way of avoiding the responsibility of her own life. And Jackson? He was exactly what they had built him to be, a parasite who thought he was a king. 3 years passed. The silence eventually became a habit. I heard through a distant cousin that Jackson had lost the BMW. Then I heard Thomas had sold the family silver. I watched from the sidelines as their world began to groan under the weight of the lies I was no longer there to support. I focused on my own empire. I started investing. I didn't buy stocks or gold. I bought debt. I worked with a private equity group that specialized in distressed mortgages. I learned that the most powerful thing you can own isn't a house. It's the piece of paper that says someone else owes you for it. I became a partner in the firm. My bonus that year was enough to buy a house in cash, but I didn't. I stayed in my high-rise, watching the rain on the windows, thinking about that Tuesday night in the driveway. I realized that I had spent my whole life being the stable one, the one who took care of the details while others dreamed. But now I was the one with the vision. I was no longer the girl in the coffee-stained uniform. I was the woman who decided which buildings stood and which ones were torn down. I had built a table where I was the only one who decided who got a seat. For 3 years, I built a life that no longer depended on their approval. I learned commercial real estate, distressed mortgages, and the quiet power of owning the paper other people were desperate to escape. By the time my family's collapse reached its final stage, I was no longer the daughter begging for respect. I was the woman who understood exactly how to turn their debt into my leverage. When I drove away from Willow Creek Drive that night, I didn't just take my suitcase and my few $100s. I took the oxygen out of that house. For years, I had been the invisible engine keeping the Miller family moving. I was the one who remembered the property tax deadlines, the one who negotiated with the utility companies when the bill was too high, and the one who quietly moved money from my savings to my father's checking account so he wouldn't see the insufficient funds notice. In their minds, the money was a natural resource, like rain. They thought it would just keep coming. They were about to learn that rain doesn't fall in a desert created by pride. The first 6 months were a slow-motion car crash. Without my 2 paychecks, the house account was a ghost town. Jackson, of course, was the first to feel the burn. His consulting meeting with the country club girl's father turned out to be a disaster. He showed up in a car he couldn't afford to wash, with a confidence he hadn't earned, and was laughed out of the office. Without me to pay the lease, the BMW was the first thing to go. I remember getting a notification on my old email, a repossession warning. I didn't call. I didn't text. I sat in my new, small apartment and watched the sunset over the city, knowing that somewhere in the suburbs, Jackson was standing in the driveway, watching a tow truck haul away his only claim to status. But the real rot was in my father. Thomas Miller was a man who believed that if you didn't talk about a problem, the problem didn't exist. It's a dangerous way to live when your mortgage is an adjustable rate. My mother, Martha, started sending me messages. They weren't apologies. They were status updates designed to make me feel guilty. "Sarah, your father's chest is tight again. He's so worried about the taxes." Or, "Jackson is so depressed, honey. He just needs a win. Do you think you could just send 500 for the family?" I read them all. I answered none. I had learned that the only way to win a game against a narcissist is to stop playing. By the second year, the silence from my end had driven them to desperation. Thomas, instead of getting a job at the local hardware store or cutting back on expenses, did the one thing a desperate man with a big ego always does. He doubled down. He took out a second mortgage on the house. He didn't tell Martha. He certainly didn't tell the world. He used the money to fund another one of Jackson's revolutionary ideas, an app that was supposed to disrupt the logistics industry. Jackson spent the next 8 months living like a CEO on borrowed time. He bought new suits, went to networking dinners, and spent $10,000 on branding while the roof of the house started to leak. The numbers told stories my father would never say out loud. While Jackson was posting photos of himself at tech mixers, the bank was sending letters with red borders. I know this because I had a contact in the local clerk's office from my work in real estate acquisitions. Every few months, I'd check the public records for 442 Willow Creek. I watched as the liens piled up. First, a tax lien. Then, a mechanic's lien from a contractor Jackson had hired for a home office renovation and never paid. And finally, the big one, the notice of default. A house going bad is like a pot of soup left on low. You don't notice it scorching until the whole kitchen smells like something you can't fix. By the 3rd year, the golden boy was a tarnished memory. Jackson was working a dead-end job at a warehouse, the very kind of job my father had once called content just clocking in and out of a cubicle. He was bitter, angry, and still living in his childhood bedroom, which was now damp from the unrepaired roof. Thomas had stopped fixing things. The lawn, once the pride of the neighborhood, was overgrown with weeds. The navy shutters were peeling. The house looked like it was grieving. My mother stopped texting me. I think the shame had finally overtaken the entitlement, or maybe Thomas had forbidden it. One evening, I drove past the old neighborhood. I stayed in my car, parked 3 houses down, headlights off. I saw Thomas come out to the porch. He looked 20 years older. He was carrying a stack of mail, that same heavy, thick mail that usually contains final notices. He didn't look at the sky or the street. He just looked at the paper in his hand, shook his head, and went back inside. He was a man who had built a life on the idea that he was the master of his domain, and now he was a guest in a house that the bank was about to take back. The final blow came in November. The auction sign didn't go up on the lawn, not yet, but the notice was posted in the legal section of the newspaper. 442 Willow Creek Drive, trustees' sale. They had 30 days. In those 30 days, the Miller family went through the final stages of collapse. Jackson blamed Thomas for mismanaging the investment. Thomas blamed the unstable market. And both of them, in the quiet moments of the night when the house was cold because they couldn't afford the oil, probably blamed me. They probably told themselves that if only Sarah hadn't been so selfish, if only she had supported the family, they wouldn't be here. They didn't understand that I wasn't the cause of their downfall. I was just the one who had stopped preventing it. I sat in my partner's office at the firm, looking at the auction listing on my screen. I could have let it go. I could have let some developer buy it, tear it down, and turn it into a modern duplex. I could have watched them be evicted by a stranger in a sheriff's uniform. But as I looked at the photo of the house where I had washed the floors, cooked the meals, and been told I was worthless, I realized that justice isn't just about walking away. Sometimes justice is about coming back and finishing the sentence. I picked up the phone. I didn't call my father. I called my LLC's attorney. I want to place a pre-auction bid on the Willow Creek mortgage, I said. Offer the full outstanding balance plus fees. I want the deed, the note, and the eviction rights, and I want it done by Friday. The family was falling, and I was the one who was going to decide exactly where they landed. It was a cold Tuesday morning in early December. I was sitting in my corner office at the firm, the Charlotte skyline spread out behind me like a grid of possibilities. I was a partner now. I had a team, a reputation for being precise. I didn't make emotional decisions at work. I made calculated ones. I was scanning the weekly distressed asset report, a list of mortgages that banks were looking to sell off to private investors to clear their books before the end of the fiscal year. Most of the entries were commercial warehouses or half-finished condo developments, but on page 14, a set of numbers stopped me cold. Property ID 40422 WC CLT. Outstanding balance $412,000. Status: final foreclosure. It was my childhood home, the house where I was told I was worthless, the house where I had been thrown out into the rain for refusing to wash a car. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked at the address. For a split second, I felt like that 29-year-old girl again, shivering at the bus stop with a sodden suitcase. But then I looked at the jade-colored fountain pen on my desk and the professional degree on my wall. I wasn't that girl anymore. I was the person who knew how the numbers worked. I picked up my phone and dialed my attorney, Marcus. Marcus, I need you to look at a specific entry on the regional lender's divestment list, I said, my voice as level as a ledger line. Property 442 Willow Creek Drive. I want it. Sarah, I've seen that one, Marcus replied, his voice crackling through the speaker. The title is messy. There are 2 tax liens and a mechanic's lien from a failed renovation. Plus, the occupants are still in residence. You'd be buying a headache. I'm not buying a property, Marcus, I said, looking out at the gray North Carolina sky. I'm buying a note. I want the debt. I want to be the one they owe. There was a long pause on the other end. Marcus had been with me since I started my LLC, North Star Acquisitions. He knew I didn't do things without a reason. Understood. You want to execute an anonymous buyout through North Star? Exactly, I confirmed. Offer the bank 90 cents on the dollar for a cash close within 48 hours. No contingencies, no inspections. Tell them we take the liens as is. If we do that, Sarah, you effectively become the bank. You'll have the right to proceed with the eviction immediately upon closing. I know, I said. That's the point. For the next 2 days, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I went to my meetings, I signed contracts, and I ate dinner in my quiet high-rise apartment. But in the back of my mind, I was walking through the rooms of Willow Creek Drive. I could see the overgrown lawn, the peeling shutters, and my father sitting in his chair, clutching a beer, still waiting for Jackson's big break to save them. On Thursday afternoon, a courier arrived with a black leather folio. Inside were the signed transfer documents. I now controlled the mortgage for 442 Willow Creek Drive. Once the foreclosure transfer finalized, North Star held the deed, the note, and the right to proceed with eviction. The bank had sent a standard notification to the occupants, my parents, stating that their debt had been assigned to a private holding company and that all future inquiries should be directed to the new servicer. They wouldn't know the new servicer was the daughter they'd discarded. I opened my laptop and looked at the family's file I had quietly compiled. Thomas's credit was a wasteland. Martha's savings were non-existent. Jackson's warehouse job barely covered his own bar tabs. They were drowning, and for the first time in 3 years, I was the only one who could see the bottom of the pool. I thought about calling them. I thought about the patient approach. But I remembered my father's voice on that rainy porch. "You're nothing without us. You're worthless." I realized then that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people who treat you like a utility is to show them exactly what happens when the power gets cut off for good. I didn't send a letter. I didn't send an email. I waited for the final foreclosure window to close, the required grace period. I watched the clock. I watched the weather reports. I wanted them to feel the weight of the silence I had lived in for 3 years. I wanted them to realize that the person they had relied on to support the family was no longer a ghost. She was the landlord. As the ink dried on the final deed transfer, I felt a strange, quiet click inside my chest. The rebuilding was over. The strategy was set. All that was left was the confrontation. I was ready to go home, but this time I wasn't bringing a suitcase. I was bringing the bill. The rain continued to lash against the grand mahogany door of my home, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to mark the seconds of a long overdue judgment. Standing in the warm, amber glow of my foyer, I looked at my parents, Thomas and Martha Miller. They were no longer the giants who had loomed over my childhood with their demands and their dismissals. In the harsh, unforgiving light of my success, they looked small. They looked like paper dolls caught in a storm, fragile and ready to tear. Thomas was still holding that wet manila envelope, his knuckles white. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was trying to reconcile the worthless girl he'd shoveled out into the rain with the woman standing before him in a $1,000 silk blouse. "Sarah," he finally managed to say, his voice cracking. We didn't know. The bank said a company called North Star Acquisitions bought the note. They said the new owner was coming here tonight to discuss the final eviction notice. We came to beg for a stay. We didn't know North Star was you." "I know you didn't, Dad," I said. My voice was steady, devoid of the jagged anger that used to keep me awake at night. It was a cold, professional tone, the kind I used when I was closing a deal that would change a city's skyline. "If you had known it was me, you would have called weeks ago, wouldn't you? You would have found a way to make it my responsibility to save you, just like you always did." Martha stepped forward, her eyes brimming with tears. "Sarah, honey, please. We're so sorry. We've had such a hard time. Jackson, he lost everything. Your father's health hasn't been good. We didn't mean those things we said. We were just stressed." "Stressed?" I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. "I spent 29 years being your stress reliever. I was the maid, the bank, and the ghost that kept the lights on. And the one time I asked for a shred of respect, you threw me out in a storm exactly like this one." I reached out and took the wet envelope from my father's trembling hand. I didn't need to open it. I already had the originals in my office. I held up the file, the legal proof that 442 Willow Creek Drive and the staggering debt attached to it now belonged to me. Do you remember what you told me that night, Dad? I asked. You told me I was nothing without this family. You told me I was worthless. Thomas looked down at his shoes. I was wrong, Sarah. I see that now. You've done so well for yourself. We're so proud of you. Proud? I let out a short, hollow laugh. You're not proud of me, Thomas. You're desperate. You're proud of the fact that I have the power to keep you from the street. But pride is earned, and so is a seat at my table. I stepped back, creating a deliberate distance between us. The day you threw me out, I continued, my voice cutting through the sound of the rain, I made a promise to myself. I decided that one day you would stand exactly where you are standing now, shivering, broken, asking me for help. I spent 3 years building a life where I never have to ask anyone for permission again. I opened the file and pulled out the deed. I held it so they could see the bold black ink of my signature. From today, I said, each word precise and final, this house is mine. Every brick, every shingle, and every unpaid bill. And because this house is mine, so are your choices. Martha's hand went to her mouth, a small sob escaping her. What are you saying, Sarah? You're going to kick us out? Your own parents? I'm doing exactly what you taught me to do, Mom, I replied. I'm protecting my assets. I'm ensuring that my hard-earned money isn't wasted on people who don't respect the work that went into it. You wanted Jackson to be the king of this family? Fine. Let him find a palace for you, but it won't be this one. Thomas looked up, a spark of the old, arrogant man flickering in his eyes. You can't do this. It's heartless. No, Dad, I said, my hand moving to the heavy brass handle of the door. It's precise. It's the long kind of justice. You told me I was worthless until you needed me. Well, I've decided that I don't need you. Not your approval, not your apologies, and certainly not your presence in my home. I looked past them at the dark, wet street. The bus stop is still at the end of the block. I suggest you move quickly before the rain gets worse. Sarah, please, Martha wailed. Good night, Thomas. Good night, Martha, I said. I didn't wait for them to answer. I pulled the door shut. The sound of the heavy oak meeting the frame was a clean final snap, the sound of a book closing on a story that had gone on for far too long. I stood in the silence of my foyer for a long moment, listening to the rain. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel sad. I felt like a woman who had finally, truly finished her work. I walked to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and watched the security feed on my phone as 2 small, dark figures walked slowly down the driveway and disappeared into the night. I didn't just survive. I won. Family is not just a birthright, it is a table you build yourself. You decide who sits at it, and you decide what kind of voice is used. For 29 years, I let my father define my worth based on how well I served his favorites. But that night in the rain, I realized that true worth isn't something you're given. It's something you claim. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for people who treat you like a utility is to refuse to let them teach you that silence in the face of cruelty is what's expected. My parents didn't lose their home because of my revenge. They lost it because they lived a lie that required my silence to survive. Now, the silence is gone. And the truth is, the only thing left standing. I didn't just survive their rejection. I built a world where I am the one who sets the terms. If this story reached you today, tell me one word in the comments. Stayed if you're still drawing new lines with your family, or left if you had to walk away to find your own strength. There is no wrong answer. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story of justice.